Good afternoon. My name is Jim Lyko, and I'm here in Essex, Connecticut on March 11th, 2009 to interview Mr. Barry Fulford, who was a youngster living in London during the Blitz of 1940. So, good afternoon, Barry.
Good afternoon, Jim, and nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, and I am looking forward to hearing about what it was like to live in London in 1940 as a youngster and experience the war. So,
well, let me give you a little bit of a start and tell you I was very young. I didn't think I was very young, but in hindsight I was only 8 years old. But fortunately, long-term memory is a lot better than short-term memory. If you asked me what I had for dinner last Tuesday, I would probably wouldn't know. But I can remember vividly it was September the 3rd when war was declared. September the 3rd, 1939, of course. And preparations had been underway, but very, very diluted. Churchill tried to, through his leadership in the Commons, he wasn't yet Prime Minister, he was the Admiralty, but he tried to warn people that we should be building stuff and we should be preparing with weapons and bullets and rifles, but no one really took any notice of him. And I don't want to digress, but there were a couple of people from a historical point of view, Lord Halifax and of course Chamberlain, who was a very ineffectual Prime Minister who really thought he had got peace in our time when he held up that piece of paper, and they were really pacifists, and thank gosh the Halifax didn't become Prime Minister because there was a toss-up, but they were very wise, the Commons, the Parliament that voted or appointed, I should say, Winston Churchill. Now, I was 8 years of age, and we lived in Wembley, which is a town, a typical suburb of London. It is now part of London. It's been acquired, annexed, and we would give the viewers a little bit of a geographical idea. Our house was actually 9 miles from Buckingham Palace, although we didn't go there very often, and we were 15 miles from the dock area, which I'll talk about later, which was the hardest East London, where unfortunately the poor people lived in very close quarters, and it was subject to the most severe bombing. As far as my family were concerned, mother and father and an older sister. I'd have preferred to have a younger sister, but I got an older sister, 5 years older, who bossed me around. But we had a good family, and we had a nice house with a nice garden. It wasn't a huge house, but English houses are much smaller than over here. And my father, who was very far-sighted, he actually had been a volunteer in the First World War in the Royal Naval Air Service, which was a forerunner of the Fleet Air Arm, you know, the planes that take off from carriers and that. Of course, they didn't have them in those days, but and he volunteered, and he was in Ypres, and he lived because he wasn't in the trenches, as I wouldn't be here otherwise, which was the carnage was terrible in the First World War. And then he volunteered again and joined a department of the Fighter Command called the Royal Observer Corps, which I'll talk about later. But he was too old to serve. He was on active service with the Royal Observer Corps, but he wasn't, drafted for any purpose. He volunteered and did a very good job. Now, he was far-sighted again in the sense that he put up a blast wall at the back of the house, and all the neighbours laughed because they said the war is going to be over in 6 weeks. Son, that was my father's first name. It wasn't really, it was Alfred, but they called him Son, and they laughed. And coincidentally, a few months later on, when my father had built a shelter in concert with the next door neighbour, who was a builder between the two houses, a lovely underground shelter that seated us, about 8 of us, and had a toilet, a portable toilet, and it had a couple of bunks. Strangely enough, the people that had laughed at us were sitting in the shelter in the first raid. They hadn't asked permission, they were so scared. And we were all scared, really. I remember feeling, on the first raid, feeling very sick. And my sister calling me a coward, but of course she was scared as well, and so were my parents. And But we did get prepared, and I think a little story again that I don't think I mentioned. My cousin, now 93, living in England, he was in the Territorial Army, which is equivalent to the National Guard, and so he was called up straight away and was made a private in the London Scottish Regiment and posted to the dock area. Now, in those days, there were lots of pea soup fogs that you probably have heard about, read about in the books and everything, and they really are. You can hardly see you're not far away from you. In a real pea soup where I could not see you, and it makes you all dirty because it gets into your eyes, your nose. And he was posted as a sentry. Now, they issued them with World War I rifles. Now, that was all right, but they hadn't got any bullets, and they hadn't got any, and so they patrol up and down. I don't know, goodness knows what happens if the Germans had come, but it was so thick, the pea soup fog, that one of his colleagues fell in the Thames. And he was screaming for help, he couldn't swim, and they eventually found a boat hook and they got him out, and he was sent to the hospital because swallowing a great amount of the Thames in those days, it was full of garbage, now salmon at London Bridge, but they cleaned it up. So he only told me that story about a month ago, and I think it's wonderful. Then he got posted out, and he ended up as a major in the Royal Army Medical Corps running a big hospital in India, not a doctor. And so we were a nice little family. Now, I had two uncles, one who had suffered very badly in the First World War, and when the first bombing started, he literally gave his house away. He sold it for $10 or something equivalent, and he disappeared into the country because he was so nervous. My other uncle, which was a very bright man, he ended up in the famous code-breaking Bletchley Park, where they, and he never, to the day he died, which was 1975, would tell me anything about it. He kept on afterwards, and where they had 4,000 people working on the codes, because the computers, they had basic, the old-fashioned big computers, but they took them ages to do that. So we were a nice little family, and so what happened after the first declaration of war, there was a period of about a year, what they called the phony war, when Hitler was busy going through Europe and conquering all the countries, and of course not getting any resistance. And so the first bombing started almost exactly a year later. I should have had that newspaper here, and I think it was August the 29th, 1940. Okay. And they hit London, and that was rather an interesting story in itself, because Hitler said, don't go after, I'm going to start bombing London, because they refused to meet, and concede defeat, and that was not on the cards at all for Winston Churchill, who was now Prime Minister. So he said, Adolf, well, bomb the dock areas, but away from the civilians. Well, they got lost in the fog, the first planes, and it's quite easy to find where London is, because you go to the mouth of the Thames in the Channel and just go upwards and it goes up. Right. And so by mistake he bombed the civilians. Now Churchill got mad, and he said, well, in that case we will bomb Berlin. Now Big Goring, who ran the Air Force in Germany, had said to Hitler, I guarantee you, mein Führer, Berlin will never be bombed. And of course, he'd never been bombed in any war. And so Churchill sent the people, the bombers, to go over, and they bombed. They only had about 50 bombers go over, and they bombed. It was a psychological thing. Now, Hitler got very mad at that, and said, well, if Churchill gets mad, and he started his big bombing. And that's where we came in, and we had the bombs in London, what I call the conventional bombs. And the bombing was very much directed at the docks. They were after the docks, because that's where today the ships don't get up there, because they're big container ships, but they were smaller ships. And of course they devastated the area, and thousands died. And I think it was 54, if I remember right, it was 54 consecutive days of night bombing. And that was difficult, you see, for the Air Force to go up, because they could, in the dark, you can't have a really big fighter effect. You can usually the anti-aircraft, and of course they don't want to shoot down their own aircraft. So, but in 54 days, it's something like 54,000 died, and that's when you think in current days, only about a 9/11, that's equivalent about having 50 9/11s, and there were 5,000 children. And I think I read a figure recently, and of course the actual estimates weren't as good as they are today with computers, etc. But I think it's probably a fair. The total bombing in all the years, including all the other weapons, the sophisticated weapons like the V1s and the V2s, they reckon about 300,000 people were killed in the whole of Britain, which is quite a figure. But anyhow, we kept up our morale. People were laughing, and British people are very reserved normally, and that my mother would call the neighbour Mrs. Smith or Mr. Smith, and after living 25 years next door. And so it brought people together, and we actually had, in that year of severe conventional bombing, we lost 3 houses in our road, which wasn't very big, and all the people were killed, and we also lost some policemen, but we didn't suffer. We had some shrapnel in our garden, as we call it. We call it the backyard here, but that's a derogatory term in England. It means where you put the old junk. So we did, I think, keep our chin up, as they say in England, because everybody got together and sort of became friendly and helped each other. Now, my father then was in the Royal Observer Corps, and he was up on these towers, and hard to describe except they would always be high. And he used to go on night duty, and he worked all day at his regular job, which is at Vauxhall, which is a division of General Motors. But he did the work of about 4 people because all the rest were called up. And so he did a spell 3 days a week, 3 nights a week, so he didn't get any sleep and he didn't get any food. And of course these towers were absolutely unprotected because they didn't have the sophisticated radar was just coming in. It was called radar direction finding, RDF, and that was very primitive. But so we got through that part of the war, and
now, were these raids every night, Barry?
Virtually every night, yes.
Goodness, so it was, and it would be most of the night, so you weren't getting a whole lot of sleep yourself.
No, but children go back to sleep very quickly.
Yeah, I guess.
After a while, it's just the parents didn't get much. Yeah. Now, we went to school every day. Yeah. My elementary school was only about 300 yards away. We took our gas masks with us, and I think in the United States you also have them over here. And in fact, no one used gas, I don't think, in World War II at all, because they'd learnt what happened in World War I. We used to have every day sit in the desk with a gas mask, and I remember my next guy sat next to me, and he said this thing to me one day, which I thought was rather funny. He said, "Barry, you know, it would be better if you kept your gas mask on." And I said, "Well, why is that, Charlie?" And he said, "Well, you look better looking with it on than off." And I said, "You silly bugger." And but we did go down, and we had shelters. I don't know, because the school was not that new, but it did have a huge basement and concrete, and we quite liked going down because we didn't have to do any lessons. And particularly if it was an algebra lesson or something like that, which I didn't really like. So we went down and we tried to sing and things like that. And
so this, you may have gotten a raid during the day, which would have required
yes,
you to go to the
directly the siren is sitting upstairs in the class, and the siren goes, you walk down, you don't run down, and we weren't hit at all. Yeah. And we did have lots of shrapnel, I said earlier, and it was sort of a competition between the boys, of course, finding the pieces of shrapnel. Well, if you were too quick, they'd be very hot, because a lot of it was not only from the aircraft being shot down, but also from the AK. And we did have what they call a Bofors gun. It's a bomb gun that seemed to be in my garden, but it wasn't, of course. It was just the noise in the dead of night, and you heard this going off, bomb, bomb, bomb. But we tried to live a normal life. The rationing, as I mentioned, we well, excuse me. Rationing, of course, came in, as like the United States. Ours is a bit more severe because one has to take into account that everything that came in, I mean, everything we did and consumed came from overseas. We had no oil, and of course the United States was magnificent in sending us all these supplies, and of course we had 2 ounces of chocolate a week, 2 ounces of 2 ounces of meat, and so on and so on and so on. Very small, but we didn't grumble, because I think one thing about the British people, they have tremendous resilience. And but I remember seeing in the newspaper of Churchill, by this time I was about 10, talking to some children, and as he did in the war, they both the Queen and the King and Churchill would try and go to the bombed out areas afterwards and commiserate with them. It was tremendous morale building, really important. And he said to you young man, he said, well, how much chocolate do you get? He said, 2 ounces, sir. Well, he said, that sounds very good to me. He said, no, sir, that's 2 ounces a week. Churchill thought 2 ounces a day. So he said, oh, I'm sorry, we have to do something about that. Well, of course, he didn't ever, he couldn't anything. But we survived, and one interesting thing is that the United States sent us over food, of course, including the famous Spam, which is selling now in this recession more than ever. We had, my mother was quite an inventive cook. We had Spam fritters, we had Spam pancakes, we had baked Spam omelets, and everything. And interestingly enough, we had some eggs, because my father decided that we were going to have a long war, and therefore he built some proper chicken sheds. They weren't in batteries, they had their own, had a thing they could sit on, a rod they could sit on in night. They liked to do that to sleep. And we had actually 13 chickens. And I remember in 1944, we had to keep a record, because the government gave us supplies, the terrible food that they ate. We got a card so that we could get some, because neighbors were registered with us. And so we clipped their ration book, and of course some of them thought they knew us so they could get extra eggs. But one Christmas day we had 13 eggs. We had 13 chickens and 13 eggs, and I used to go down, and particularly after my father died, I had to go down and feed the chickens. And I always remember my mother, 2 smells. One was of this ghastly chicken stuff, food that was like a meal that she used to have to put on the stove, and I would go down, and the other smell was, of course, the gas mask, the rubbery smell. I can still remember that to this day. And I was doing all right until one day I used to go and get the eggs, and they got to know me, and of course the earth was so rich, I used to have to dig it up because they get the little stuff, insects and stuff. Yeah. And I went in one day, and there was the largest rat you could ever see sitting there. Now I was cornered. You know what rats do, they usually go for your throat, but fortunately he was a sick rat. So I beat a hasty retreat, and the council came and sent someone round, and he was a sick rat. So I was a little bit hesitant. I used to say, anybody there? Next time I go.
Make some noise, yes.
Yes. So we did survive, and of course we could eat a little more eggs than most people. There was unfortunately a black market, always, and if it would happen here, it happens everywhere, in Germany, France, and but you know, my father was he did have an allowance, a gas, we call a petrol allowance, a gas allowance, because he had to use the car backwards and forwards, to the observer corps. I just wanted to talk to you about the shelters. I referred to the one that was built in the garden, but unfortunately, because the rain in Britain is constant, there's an old saying that you don't get suntan in England, you go rusty, because there's no way you can, and this was a very wet period, and the water level came up, so we couldn't use that. So the government provided what they call, it was the Home Secretary, named after the Morrison shelter. Okay. And that was like imagine your dining room table about 3 times as large, with a piece of steel about that thick on the top. And then it had 4 corners, and then it had these fencing like wire that you clipped on as you got in to stop the blast. But it took 4 men to come in and put this, it was so heavy. But that could stand almost a direct hit. It certainly would. You'd be all right if the next door neighbour was bombed, but if, of course, direct hit is not very. It's very difficult to. So we did have the shelters. In addition, we had a shelters, I should say, in the road, in the public road, because we had a station just about a quarter of a mile away, probably a bit more than that. And so if someone was getting out of the train and the sirens, he or she was halfway home, and the sirens went and the bombers were overhead, they could nip into this shelter. Now, it was just a brick shelter, and it was very dark, had no lights, and it was purely just to stand there and wait and then go. But again, I got into trouble with my mother because I said, what are these people, couples, going into the shelter, and there's no air raid warning? And she said, shut up and eat your food. And apparently this was couples going in for a bit of slap and tickle, which is a nice way of saying it.
Yes. They were getting used, weren't they?
Yes. Now, I'm just going to pause here, if I may.
No, big time. It's,
Yes, okay. I think we have to go on to the next stage, which is we're going to talk about the other bombing that happened. But I think I just want to say first about the Royal Observer Corps, because they, as I said earlier, were on this tower, and they could be easily destroyed because they stood up high. They had to be on a hill, and of course the fighters and the dive bombers could come over and wipe them out. But they were very simple, so because they were simple, they could be in 8 hours they could build another one, and they did that. And but they were very instrumental in stopping and reporting to the fighter command in the night. In the daytime, the fighter command did the spotting themselves. At night, they would see through their binoculars and telescopes, very simple stuff, and this primitive RDF that I mentioned earlier. And their mission was then to contact the Royal Air Force. They say, we see 25 Heinkel so-and-sos coming over. Air Force would go up and shoot them down. That was the whole thing. But they did have a great purpose, and apparently they were responsible for quite a lot of aircraft being shot down. And also later on, when we get to talk about the V1s and the V2, well, not the V2s, of course, but the V1s they shot down. Now, the two things that they're well known for outside of Britain and inside Britain, people didn't really know them because they tried to keep it secret. Although my father, he was very good at aircraft identification. In fact, he had the cards, they all had the cards, they had to take an examination. But it's rather strange, really, because they had to identify these aircraft, and the cards were a black silhouette. And on the other side was what the Heinkel 102 was. Yep. And I'd hold it up to him and say, what is this? And he'd say, I think it's a Heinkel. He'd get it right mostly. Yeah. But I couldn't understand how they could see at night a black silhouette. Yeah. But they did. But the famous examples were Rudolf Hess, who was the deputy Führer. He really thought he was a sensible man, a little bit, I think he was a little bit mentally retarded. He wanted to make peace. And so he thought, he was told that the Duke of Sutherland in Scotland was a pro-Nazi. And so he got into his Focke-Wulf 110, a fighter aircraft, and on the way. And he's over the middle of England, going to Scotland. The Royal Observer Corps got him and called the fighter command, and they said, oh no, you're wrong, because they didn't really have, they were the full-time guys, and it was a little bit of jealousy between the two. And they said it couldn't possibly be that, because it's a fighter and it doesn't have the fuel to stay over England more than a quarter of an hour. It has to go back again. And they said yes, and they said no. Well, actually, in hindsight, when history was, when they disclosed what happened, he didn't want to go back. He wanted to stay, and he was very unhappy because the Duke wasn't at all pro-Nazi. He was anti-Nazi. So they stuck him in poor Spandau prison for the rest in Germany for the rest of his life. Poor guy. So we go on, I think, to the next stage, which is the V1s, and still life went on. I probably should have mentioned earlier that I had then moved to the high school. I was 11 years of age when we went to the high school, and we played cricket and we played soccer, and now things were just the same as they were in the elementary school, although we didn't have any shelters there, but we managed to get through a regular curriculum, and we'd sort of at this stage got used to it, if we could say that.
Now, had the bombing let up some?
Started to taper off.
Taper off.
Yes.
Okay.
They were losing too many bombers, and they hadn't got enough fighters, and I think this is not part of our purview today, but if you look at what happened with the Sea Lion, that the reason why they didn't come was a lot of different reasons, but they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the barges, and they didn't have the Air Force. So the Royal Air Force did a wonderful job. The Battle of Britain was now on, and of course most people know what happened. It was a great victory for Britain, and although again we must acknowledge that there were many of the old ex-colonial countries today. They sent over not Czech, but the Czech pilots came, and the Polish were some of the best. But they came from Australia, came from New Zealand, and came from Canada, and the United States.
I think there were 4 or 5 from
Yes,
the United States.
yeah, they wanted to fight.
Yes.
Yes, despite the fact that, of course, we had an ambassador, Kennedy, that was really given up on us. He said they won't last 7, they're cowards, the Brits and everything, and they hauled him away, FDR. Actually, I only read recently the top fighter pilots that shot down the most was a Czech and a Polish.
Yes.
And but the only problem with the Polish, as I've read and I've heard, they didn't speak very good English. So in the air, they had a communication because the squadron leader kept on having to tell him, speak English, and they get enthusiastic, but they were very good. So by this time, we had really finished with the conventional bombing. It was irregular. No longer it was every night. So we breathed a sigh of relief, and we got back to normality. Now the next thing we have, I think we have a thing here, Jim, that you provided. We had what we call the flying bomb.
Okay, little. Perfect, yes.
And this is just the inner workings of it,
yes.
Because it was the first almost jet aircraft. It was a non-pilot. There were no pilots. It came off a ramp, and then it came along, and I turned this round, and I got it the right way up, have I?
The other way, down. No, turn the board. There you go. No, one. There you go. Okay.
And that was what we saw. We actually saw these at night. And they, the little rocket, the flames came out of the back. You can just see here, you can't see it, I think you can see a little bit of it. But they were very bad from a psychological point of view, because they came with, as we've talked before, they had a sort of staccato engine, which would go boom, 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 boom.
Pulsate, yes.
Pulsating.
Yes.
And then it stopped. That meant they cut the supply off. It was either done automatically, programmed in, and then it would go down. So we would be in the shelter, and then we'd hear this damn thing come along, and I'm afraid to say that we were just human people. We always hoped it would go to the next door. Well, not the next door, but then, and of course then we heard the big explosion. It felt as if it was coming on our house, because at night there was nothing, no noise. There were, the Beauforts would try and get it, but the worst part of it was the psychology, that you didn't know where it was going to do, and they did tremendous damage, and about 10,000 people were killed between that and the rocket, which I'll talk about later. And the Air Force shot down, I think, about 5,000 of them. The ACAC shot down about 5,000, and the Air Force, some of the brilliant pilots, and they were 18-year-olds, these guys, and they'd had a very quick, of course, the fatalities in training were terrible, because they tried to cram them in these little tiny aircrafts. And they shot down But one of the skills of the Royal Air Force, the real daredevils, and probably these are the Czechs and the Poles included, they would go up and tip it over. And of course it would go down then in the country areas. They get it when it came over the channel, and they did that.
Using their wing, they would tip
yes.
Yeah.
But then about 300 of them, and I don't think we have a photograph of the barrage balloons. They were a big balloon that on a huge big wire that would go up several hundred feet. And so it would trap the plane, and it would go explode in the air. And that brings me back to the other thing. I mentioned two things that the Royal Observer Corps were famous for. Well, the other one is that in some of the areas, it was, when we think about it today, it was so primitive, and they were doing this on the telephone there wasn't a computer that you get through immediately, and if they didn't have enough time, because if the V1 came out of the clouds, they'd have to move fast, so they had these little I think you would call them 50-cent rockets. They were called snowflakes, and they would light this thing and go up, and then everybody around in the area would know that there's a plane coming down, and they could dive for the shelter or something.
So they were used for warning.
Yes, only warning.
Yes.
But on this day, it was in the Midlands. The Royal Observer Corps saw it as it came out of the clouds, and so they shot it off, and this was probably about 1 trillion to 1. They hit the fuse box at the back, and it exploded, and they got all the stuff. They did wear steel helmets. That's the only thing they had, and it came all over them, and they really and became famous. And I think they're still, if there's so many alive still, they're still dining on that story. So 300 were shot down by not shot down, but were disposed of through the barrage balloons. 10,000 by the ACAC and 10,000 on that, but 1 by the Royal Observer Corps. So I have to tell you that story.
Great story.
Now the next stage of the four parts that we talked about, we did the phony war, and we did the regular bombing, conventional bombing, and we did the V1s. Now we get to the V2s, and the V2s, the rocket was the first actually supersonic, and of course it was von Braun, the guy that invented it, who then became over here to start our rocket space program. Yes, and there was no defense at all, and you didn't really worry about it, because if you got killed, you got killed, because they would take out, even as a child, we just knocked, just discarded the fact that we didn't look out for one, because they came out of nowhere. They were going thousands of miles an hour, and they were no warning at all. And I seem to remember a Woolworth store, not in my road, but 2 or 3 miles away, got taken out, and everything, 200 people got taken out. But by this time, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were moving further in, and the Pas de Calais was the area where they were coming from, and also later on they moved into Germany to I think it was Peenemünde, but as fast as the troops were moving fast, were advancing, they could knock out these things. I didn't think I showed you some of the photographs that we should take, and if we can.
Absolutely. Let's see what we have there. This is, tell me about that, Barry. That looks like...
This is starting of the war. This is, the troops were going off to war, and you can see the kids with their gas masks on, they were being evacuated. Evacuated, yes. And then we have another one.
There was another evacuation maybe on the back of that one. Yeah, those are children, yes, carrying their gas masks up.
And then on the other side, we have got Tower Bridge, London Bridge, and after a bombing raid...
Those are the dockyards here.
Dockyards in East of London, yes. And then St Paul's, which, as you know, is Christopher Wren's great...
down a little. Yeah.
Down. Perfect, It was...
famous photograph. Yeah.
Famous for... It actually the tower got bombed and caught fire, and the tower was made of wood. And obviously it was very high up. I think you can just about see it at the top on here. And so they had a human chain from the bottom of the floor, of buckets of water, and they managed to put it out and no damage to the cathedral itself. So that was almost a miracle, people say. Now, oh yes, this is a picture. Yeah. This is probably an up.
Down a little.
This is he was standing on the top of a building. This is not. He was really an air raid warden.
Okay.
And he had stuck up there. Just I think
he's a civilian.
He's a civilian. Yes.
Volunteered too.
Yes. He's not like part of the Royal Air Force or anything like that. So I just wanted to mention our morale that we talked about earlier, because the V1s, the V2s, they killed a lot of people, but always the morale was very good, and we had these songs that you may have heard over here. Some are maybe American. You got to hang. Excuse me. You got to hang out your washing on the Siegfried line. And run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, rabbit. That was Adolf. Adolf, run, run, run. And there were some lovely ones, and I think the one that I liked the best, which I think you heard me say before, was the song that the recruits to the army were supposed to be singing to the sergeant major. And if I can tune my voice in properly, and this was the funniest one, and it was had a little bit of a lapse. I should have had the thing.
Sergeant.
Go, kiss. There we are. Now I've got it now. Kiss me goodnight, Sergeant Major. Guess you tuck me in my little wooden bed. Da 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 da. Sergeant Major, and be a mother to me. Now that was something which I don't think in these days that you would be singing to. But the idea of us saying this to a sergeant major would have probably been disaster. But they had all these songs, and A Long Way to Tipperary, da-da-da-da-da-da, Goodbye Piccadilly, Farewell Leicester Square.
Music is wonderful.
Music is wonderful.
Yes.
And you remind me of that when I think I said before, when we talked earlier, my brother-in-law was in the army. Well, he wasn't my brother-in-law then, he was my intended brother-in-law, my sister. They were engaged, and he got leave. I mean, it's quite incredible. They came home, he'd been wounded, they sent him into a hospital, and they sent him back again because he was a tanker. He was in an American tank, Sherman tank, and he was in D-Day. He didn't get wounded on D-Day, he got wounded later on, and they brought him back, put him back in again. But he had leave. They'd taken from the line, because it wasn't that far in terms of mileage, and he was keen to be on my sister's best side, so he used to take me out. We didn't have a lot of money, though we did own our own house, thank goodness, and we didn't have much entertainment, but all the theatres were open still, particularly for the troops, and the Americans had come in now, and huge quantities, and we had 3 million Americans before the D-Day. And he used to take me, and he took me to, I always remember, he took me to the Garrick Theatre, and it was 2 hours without a blush, and it was the American illusionist Dante. No one's ever heard of him over here, but he did exist. He was a wonderful guy, and he did these wonderful illusions, and he was responsible for me taking up magic as a hobby. And I, in fact, performed only once in the West End, and then I did several other things, but so he was good to me, Fred, and he's now 85 and he's still suffering from his wounds, but he's lasted this long. What else can I say is that the friendship, I'll go back again, the friendship that we had with people, strangers, and even and the Americans were very friendly. The soldiers, we didn't have too many coming to Wembley, but I was hoping that I'd see one, because I'd heard from one of my schoolmates that if you met an American and they asked you which way to go to so-and-so, and you said, they'd say, have a stick of gun. have a stick of gum, chum. Well, there I'm outside Preston Road Station, nearest station, about half a mile from me. There came in this immaculate, I thought it was at least a general, but of course your uniforms were much better than ours. And he had the two-tone, and he said, "Hi." No one ever said hi in England before, so I said, "Oh." And he said, "I wonder if you could tell me how to get to College Road." I said, "I will take you to College Road." He didn't say much on the way. He wasn't the usual American. He was a little bit taciturn. But when I got to the gate, he said, "Thank you very much, would you?" And then he got into his pocket and he said, "Would you like a stick of gum, chum?"
Ah. And you chewed that for how long?
I think I chewed it for 3 weeks and I didn't think much of it because there was not much flavour, Jim.
But you wouldn't give it up, right?
No, I wouldn't give it up. Well, and then, of course, the great thing happened in 1945. We'd overrun, the Germans had surrendered. The Pacific War was still on, where mostly American forces were. And we did have a big party on VE Day. And that was a block party, you call it in this country. It was in a cul-de-sac. We didn't have much to eat, but it was the fun part. We didn't have to worry. And then we returned to normal. And all in all, it was a wonderful experience in an odd way. It made people tougher. And I think it's well known that adversity is supposed to be good for the soul, but we didn't appreciate that at the time. And we didn't, in fact, go off rationing until the 50s. In fact, I was a management trainee with Cadbury's, the big chocolate company, the world's largest. And when I had to go out on the road first with my sample case, and we used to have to tell them, this is in 1953, we'd go into the store and we'd tell them what they could have. You can have one of those, you can have a Brazil nut, you can have a box, of course, bars, and you could have one of the fruit and nut. And that lasted for much longer than it did in this country. Because although we'd have fantastic help under the Marshall Plan, because we were all bankrupt, Europe was mostly bankrupt, the Marshall Plan was a genius idea. And I think we only paid off the loan about 5 years ago. But we suffered. I mean, the building when I was in the army in Germany in 1950, and they had cleaned up their bombing damage, which overall was much worse than us because it was a much larger country. But we were still struggling because there wasn't the money. Mm-hmm. But overall, I think that's a good summation of what happened in my blitzkrieg.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, tell me a little bit about, as you said, post-war, and now you're working for the chocolate people. So take me through a little bit of that and your career in business and how you ended up here in Essex, Connecticut.
Well, fine. I'd be happy to do that, Jim. Actually, I joined Cadbury as a management trainee. I originally worked, before I went into the Army, Oxford University Press in the editorial department in the heart of London. And I really didn't like that very much, but I came out of the Army and life was a little tough. There weren't very many jobs, so I went back to the Oxford Press, and then I discovered an advert, which was where the jobs that were available. It was a telegraph, and they wanted trainees, management trainees, for certain things. And so I wrote, and lo and behold, I got selected, and I had to go into the factory. They couldn't do that today, but they told us in advance, you have to go through the factory. The big Quaker company, which is marvelous for the people, they treat their people very well. The same as Hershey today. It is no longer a Quaker company, but they had Boys Town, and now it's Girls and Boys Town. And I did 6 weeks on night work, and it's the noisiest thing I always remember, the clanging of the molds as they were beaten out. The chocolate goes along in a mold like your wife has for her pastries, except they're bigger, and they were metal in those days. And then they went through the heating tunnel, and a hammer went down. And all this, now they're plastic, of course, and there's not the noise. And then I already indicated I wanted to go overseas, and they said, well, you've got to do 2 or 4 or 5 years in this country. And so I then, coincidentally, I got a territory in the dock area from London Bridge. I covered all the dock area, all the spice houses had been, many of them have survived. You know, they brought the indigo and stuff in the 17th century and 18th century. And they survived, and I had Guy's Hospital, which was a famous hospital that was also bombed. And so I got to see all the people that I'd read about. And they were incredible people, the Cockneys. They are very tough, but very generous and very honest. And in those days, because, well, it was hard to think that this would happen, but they paid in cash, because a lot of them didn't have bank accounts, because you had to have a lot of money. And of course, it also helped on the income tax side, I think.
Yeah.
So they gave us these wallets, and at lunchtime I'd have to get rid of it, so I'd go into any bank, because we had accounts, and I'd have £200, which is that thick, and then at the end of the night, the banks were closed, I had to take it with me. But I walked and rode. I got a car after a year, and so then I was lucky enough to be chosen to come over here, which was my original intent, to go overseas. But I didn't realize Cadbury's is still the largest chocolate company in the world, with operations in China, Russia, everywhere. But we had, in those days even, we were in Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica, and I could have ended up in any of those, Nigeria as well. I was lucky enough to get chosen for here, and I came over for 7 months, and I've been here ever since. And I retired after about 35 years. I lived in Greenwich. I lived in Manhattan for 10 years, and I moved to Greenwich when it became Cadbury Schweppes. And then I retired 9 years ago to this beautiful village that you and I are sitting in today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now this, have you kept in contact, or had you kept in contact with any of the folks, the fellows you grew up with, who would have experienced the same thing? I mean,
yes, but we never talked about it, because we all knew, unless we lost someone that was killed in the family, we never. I did meet with some people I hadn't seen for 50 years. Had a group of people, but they'd all forgotten about it. It happened to everybody, you see. It's not like New York just being bombed and the rest of the West. Yes, it was all over, so they didn't really talk about it very much. They got on with it. They got on with it. And the expression that I mentioned earlier, you can delete if you want to, but it wasn't keep your chin up, it was keep your pecker up. They didn't. That was a different. It meant your chin in England, but it means something. And we had this wonderful thing. In San Francisco, when I was escorting the director of sales from Cadbury, England, and in those days, believe it or not, if you can remember, you went straight to the plane. And you got up the stairway and you went in, and he came, and we had a group of salesmen, American salesmen at the bottom to see him off. As he got to the top of the stairs, he said, "Well, chaps," he said, "it's been a wonderful experience. It's going to be tough for you getting Cadbury's into this country, but keep your pecker up." And they all thought this was fantastic.
Oh, I'll bet that turned some heads, yes. Oh, that's great. Well, the fact that you're sharing now with here in Essex at the library and the local high school, and with us here at the Veterans History Project, it's very special, and your story is very special from the war years. Your viewpoint, your experience as a young lad, it's very special. So. Are we done then, Gary? Barry, I think you've covered us.
Yes.
Brought us right up to you being here in this Essex. And
I became, one thing I missed out, which is very important, I think, I became a United States citizen in 1980.
Oh, wonderful.
And so because there was a war about taxation without representation, and I didn't like that. So.
Well, that's, yes. Well,
so thank you very much.
We thank you at the Veterans History Project. I'm here representing Central Connecticut State University, which is an archive partner of the Library of Congress. And Barry Fulford, I thank you. It's been a pleasure, and it's been an honor to meet you and have this opportunity to interview you again.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now you better see if it's... got the sound.
Oh, no, we're there, Mike. We're done now.
Oh, good.
This is